In 1910, a fire devastated the forests of Idaho, Montana, and Washington, wiping out 3 million acres of vegetation and killing 85 people. While no official cause was ever stated, the largest contributor to these fires were railroads. In a 1911 report, a supervisor of the Coeur d'Alene National Forest estimated that well over 100 fires were started by coal-powered locomotives that frequently spewed out red-hot cinders onto bone-dry forest floor. These cinders would easily ignite small trees, brush, and dead plants, and would often lead to larger, more dangerous fires. Railroads did, however, do small fire prevention by hiring spotters to walk along the tracks and douse flare-ups. But as summer drew on, creek beds all but dried up and created a lack of water in the area, a resource very useful to fighting fires. Eventually, the inevitable happened. In combination with a bad electrical storm in North Idaho, multiple fires erupted along the newly erected train tracks and created a massive flare-up. This turned bad quickly. Without proper equipment and with the Forest Service being so young, little was able to be done to stop the blaze, and the fires flamed on for days on end. Property was demolished, houses were burnt, and natural forest completely obliterated. After the fire was eventually stopped, the ruin was unimaginable. Plenty of animals were dead, massive habitats were gone, and homes were destroyed. It was clear this was terrible. This wreckage of forest land is now known as the worst forest fire in U.S. history and likely the worst in the world. Images show insane spectacles of wrecked land and destroyed ecosystems. Following the fire, the U.S. Forest Service, in cooperation with the Civilian Conservationist Corps, had a great idea. Watch for fires and stop them before they spread. Enter the fire lookout. These lookouts would be placed all over the U.S.'s protected forests, aimed at spotting fires. These towers ranged from being a couple hundred feet in the air to sitting on the ground atop tall mountain peaks. Regardless, by the late 1930s, over 5,000 towers looked over forests in the U.S., watching closely for any sign of smoke rising from the forest floor. In the early years of fire lookouts, a person manning the lookout wore several hats. On an average day, lookouts would wake up and look for fires. If, by chance, they happened to spot one, they would pack up their tools, like hatchets, shovels, and helmets, and head to the location they spotted it, acting as firefighters or smoke chasers until the full crews could arrive. During World War II even, these lookouts acted as air raid warning sites and spotted potential enemy bombers making their way to the U.S., especially on the West Coast. With protection in place and people able to spot the fires, there was another issue: how to tell the firefighters and rangers where the fire was in the woods. The solution? The Osborne Firefinder. William Bushnell Osborne was a young graduate forester who worked for the Forest Service in 1909 at the Oregon National Forest. In 1911, Osborne invented a radio measuring device he dubbed the Firefinder. The Firefinder was a round disc set in the middle of a lookout with a map of the surrounding area on it. In the middle of the map was the lookout. A small slit and a string pointed at the fire and told the direction in degrees in relation to the lookout. This was a good start, because it narrowed down where the fire was from the whole forest to just a line. But a line isn't very useful when the lookouts can see out the forest for miles on end. So they needed to tell the distance. Determining the distance was much trickier, however, and could typically only be done through estimation or by triangulating the fire's position between two towers. With the knowledge of where another tower was and their measurement of the fire in degrees, using some simple math, lookouts could deduce the distance of the fire with impressive accuracy. Once the position was gathered, lookouts would use heliographs, a device that used sunlight to send Morse code messages, to send messages back to rangers. Over time, communication methods became more and more advanced, and eventually, a single strand of galvanized wire transported telephone messages back and forth. And as fire lookout employment began to wane, portable radios began being used as well. But other than the few forms of radio communication, lookouts are largely on their own, and their job is very isolating. While every fire lookout situation is different, most cannot be easily accessed for hours or sometimes even days. Take this lookout for example. Atop a tall mountain, Alpine Lookout is an impressive 6,235 feet in elevation, and has a spectacular view of the national forests that surround it. In order to reach this point, lookouts would have had to travel 10 to 12 miles through densely crowded woods, traveling by foot and alone. With them, they would need to carry clothes, tools, supplies, food, and water. And for early lookouts, once there, they often didn't enjoy the luxury of a solid roof over their head. This tower, like many others in the early days, only began with an outdoor firefinder, a tent, and a phone. An alpine lookout stayed like this until 1936, when a proper ground house was constructed, and later in 1975, a standard R6 flat-top cab was created, which remains there in active service to this day. The lookout stationed in this tower gets little to no internet service, few human interactions, and little to entertain themselves beyond books and games. These fire towers worked really well. They spotted the fire, relayed the message to the people who needed it, and got the proper crew to work dousing the fire within hours. In fact, they might have worked too well. Over the course of many decades, forest workers worked hard to suppress fires and dangers in the woods to prevent them from spreading, which ended up increasing the amount of easily burnable fuel on the forest floor. In Yellowstone National Park, acres upon acres of twigs, branches, leaves, and dead plants sat, ready to ignite with one strike of lightning. And that's exactly what happened. In June of 1988, 18 lightning strikes in the woods of Yellowstone National Park ignited fires. Upon initial assessment and consideration, the park management determined that these fires were not harming any property or life, and that the best course of action was simple: let the fires burn themselves out. And it worked, like planned, for 11 of them. However, 7 other fires continued to burn unchecked, quietly eating up more fuel and expanding. Park managers and fire specialists agreed that these fires would be able to continue to burn because they weren't posing any threat, and they thought that rain was just around the corner in July, just as had done in the decades past. That is, until no rain fell in July. On July 15th, because of these dry and desolate conditions, the Forest Service made a statement preventing any and all new fires from burning, ordering that they must be put out immediately. What the Forest Service didn't do was put out the already existing fires. Within weeks of the fire start, their acreage more than doubled to 17,000, which is when the Forest Service began to get their fires on the radar. A few days later, the Forest Service ordered for all fires, including those already burning, to be suppressed. Only a day later, the North Fork fire began to devastate much of Yellowstone's western woods. This began to get bad. With almost all of Yellowstone's fragile ecosystem engulfed in flames, the firefighters were backed into a corner. The dead plants and dry brush created the perfect atmosphere for a fire to spread and grow. Firefighting crew began to scramble to not only stop the fire, but to save themselves, jumping into rivers, creeks, lakes, or whatever thing they could find to protect themselves from the blaze. Fire lookout towers sprawled across the region had to be evacuated. On a backcountry fishing trip, Vice President George H.W. Bush was forced to leave when the fire got too close to his camp, and hundreds of hotels and resorts had to be temporarily shut down because of the flames. With little luck in dousing the fire, it continued to spread over the course of the following month, devouring more and more land and spitting it out as burnt crisps of what it once was. At its peak, on what became known as Black Saturday, the fire doubled to more than 480,000 acres. Houses were destroyed, historic sites burnt to crisps, and once prominent system of fire lookouts were no more. The fires were only put out thanks to the help of Mother Nature. On September 11, 1988, a quarter inch of snow and rain stopped the fire in its tracks and led to its dispersal. This massive fire showed the true issue behind fire lookouts. They were just too good. They had spent decades stopping the fires from spreading and believing that they were saving the habitat that the fire was eating up, when in reality, they were not. These Yellowstone fires are often cited as our understanding of how forest fires and ecosystems can be beneficial when they're regular and naturally caused. Where the parks and forests run into an issue is when no fires occur for a long time and one single fire wipes out and devastates hundreds of thousands of acres of land. All in all, this fire alone affected 36%, or 793,000 acres of the park, resulted in the death of 300 large mammals, elk, bison, deer, and moose, cost $120 million just to fight the fire, and required 10,000 personnel to douse the blaze. The devastation was obvious, and it's still clear to this day. Fire lookouts once stood as a shining star of America's determination to save its forests, but then they showed their true issues. Nowadays, we know far more than we did back then and can fight forest fires far better. With the invention of Smokey the Bear and anti-wildfire campaigns, the Forest Service is trying now more than ever to crack down on human-created fires. And it has been kind of working. Since 1995, the Forest Service has seen a slower increase in human-created forest fires when compared to lightning-created ones, which is good. But human-created forest fires still continue to rise, and total wildfires are more every year than in years prior. With our newfound understanding of the ways forest fires are beneficial, rangers, lookouts, and firefighters have all been trained to match nature better. But as technology evolves, human intervention declines, and throughout the 20th century, fire lookout popularity began experiencing a sudden drop. By 1964, only 250 lookouts remained in use, and many others fell into disrepair. Today, only a few fire lookouts remain manned in secluded places, and all of the other lookouts' jobs have been taken over by patrol planes, cameras, and even drones. But while their usefulness is less and less as the years go on, they still remain a staple of American ingenuity, love for nature, and determination.